Today we will continue our journey along the beautiful Amalfi Coast. We're headed towards the town of Positano and are going to stop at some of the best known spots along the way. Starting in Ravello, we were travelling by bus, so to break up the trip, we stopped at the famous bridge Fiordo Di Furore and headed to the beach underneath. The popularity of this place caused one major problem that made the experience fairly unpleasant. Even though the view is fantastic and it's a really beautiful place, that corner of the beach where the sun is shining and everyone is congregating stinks like a toilet. There is no avoiding this, that the small waterway with so many people makes it not a nice place to swim. However, if you go to the other end of the beach, into the shadows where it's less crowded, it was tolerable, but that lingering smell saw us getting out of there fairly quickly. The bus ride was fairly entertaining in parts, with some of the small spaces that cars and buses have to squeeze through led to some amusing stalemates, and the bus drivers, of course, throwing their weight around with their larger vehicle. But when the bus is cruising along, the views along the coast are fantastic. Before you get into the town of Positano, there's an elevated walkway that has great views over the beach and the town itself. Strangely, this is actually the best place you will get anywhere in Positano to actually see the village, because once you get further down, it is so crowded and dense you can't see much at all. So while the walkways that wind their way through this village have a certain charm, it is very overwhelming with the amount of people that are trying to squeeze through them. So we found ourselves retreating to a restaurant with a nice water view. And that experience was about what you would expect from a restaurant that's there just to serve tourists. The food looked great, but the taste was below average. But the view was very nice, and we were happy to be removed from the surrounding crowds and the chaotic streets. After lunch, we intended to head down to the beach for a swim, but it is a really crowded place. It's not particularly welcoming, and you can only really get comfortable if you pay for a sunbed. These are not cheap, and unless you're going to stay all day, probably not worth it. By this point, we were actually struggling to find reasons to stay in Positano. So due to the crowds and the hot weather, we thought it best to jump on a ferry and head to one of the less popular beaches so we could go for a swim that afternoon. And as you can see from the footage, even the ferries were jam-packed. But we did get some of the best views of the day from on the ferry looking back at the shoreline. To escape the crowds, we went all the way past Amalfi to the town of Maiori. The beach here had much more space and it was very easy to walk around in the water, have a swim and cool off. Later on, we retreated back to our mountaintop oasis at Ravello. After experiencing all the crowds in Positano, Amalfi and everywhere in between, we were very happy to have this secluded space up in the top of the mountains to enjoy great food and wine. The village of Positano has developed a reputation for being overly crowded and very touristy. And to be honest, there's not much we saw today that would make a case against that. Having said that, it's absolutely worth a visit. It was a nice day trip, but I would never stay there and I probably wouldn't go back.